was in a jeu where faultless drafts bearing my Mypanisia. Thomas's. He'd been quietly selling off Callahan, steal subsidiary rights, rerouting money through shell corporations I didn't recognize. I remember sitting there, the house silent, the snow falling again outside like it had the night he was born. I waited until morning to confront him. "Tell me it's not true," I said as he walked into the study, still half asleep. He froze when he saw the papers spread across my desk. His mouth opened, closed again. "Dad, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." I cut him off. "You've been bleeding the company dry. Your mother's company." "My company." He tried to approach, his hands up, like I was some wild thing that might bolt. "It's not like that. I had to." The board was threatening too. "Don't you dare lie to me," I roared. My hand slammed against the oak desk so hard the pen jar toppled. "You stole from your family." He stood there, jaw clenched, and in that silence between us, something broke. "Not just trust something older, something sacred." "I did what I had to do," he said finally, his voice cold. "You wouldn't let me lead. You kept treating me like a child. You built this empire, but refused to let me inherit it. Maybe I just took what was already mine." Those words haunted me. Even now, as I drifted toward death, they echoed. Maybe I just took what was already mine. I remember the way he said it, that self-righteous tone that sounded so much like my own when I was younger. And that was the cruelest part. I'd made him. I'd made the man who would destroy me. We didn't speak for years after that. I cut him off from the company, stripped him of his title, but not his name. That I couldn't bring myself to do. Every night I wondered where he was, if he was eating, if he hated me or pitied me. Margaret would have wanted me to forgive him sooner. Shuad always said, "He's got your fire, Daniel." That's more the letter came. Première nuit 20 de ketchup. It was the weight of everything, On said. The doctors told me I wouldn't make it through the month. That kind of truth makes a man reorder his priorities. I called him, left messages. He didn't answer. Then on. Evening, as the sunset painted the hospital, walls a deep gold, he appeared in the doorway. Older now, more tired. His hair streaked with grey, his eyes shattered by guilt or maybe exhaustion. "Dad," he said softly. I didn't speak at first. I couldn't. Seeing him there, the boy I'd loved and the man I'd betrayed. Me occupying the same body, it hollowed me out. "I heard you were dying," he said after a moment, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Figured I should see you before I'm gone." I asked, my voice cracked with the effort. "Or before the lawyers finalized the estate." He flinched, just slightly. "I'm not here for that." "No, then what are you here for?" He didn't answer right away. He pulled a chair close, sat beside me. I don't know. Maybe to say I'm sorry. I wanted to laugh, but the pain in my chest wouldn't let me. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did. I know." He looked down at his hands. "But maybe it's a start." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the beeping machines and the distant hum of nurses in the hallway. I saw in him a boy again, the boy who once built toy bridges on my office floor while I drafted contracts. The boy who called me his hero. And for that fleeting second, I felt forgiveness rise like a tide I couldn't hold back. So I said it. I forgave him, but forgiveness is not the same as trust. Love does not mean blindness. And so, as he wept beside me, I signed the document that severed his inheritance forever. I gave everything to charity, to the workers he'd once exploited, to the people who'd built the empire he'd tried to claim. And when I died, I took with me the peace that comes from knowing he would never again profit from my name. Yet, even as darkness claimed me, I wondered would that decision damn me, or save him? The night after my death, the storm came. It wasn't the gentle kind that passes with a sigh, but a furious, howling one that ripped branches from trees and sent power lines sparking into the black. My lawyer, Richard, told me once that storms have a way of marking turning points in a family's story. Maybe he was right. That night, while thunder rolled like judgment, my son stood alone in the library of the house I built. The will-eyed sign still lying, sealed on Richard's desk downtown. He'd arrived late, long after the doctors called it. The nurse said he just sat there, holding my hand, even after they'd covered my face. I don't know what he thought in that moment. Maybe he was waiting for my eyes to open, for me to say I'd changed my mind. But death doesn't deal in second drafts. They buried me 3 days later, beside Margaret, on the hill overlooking The steel mills that bore our name. I'd chosen that spot long before the rift with Thomas, long before any betrayal, thinking it would remind me of what I built. No huit serve. À sa warning. Thomas stood at the head of the coffin, his face carved into something unreadable. I imagine he thought about all the things he wanted to say, but never did. When the priest finished speaking, he stepped forward, laid a single white rose on the coffin, and whispered something no one else could hear. After the funeral, everyone drifted away, the board members, the old family friends, the vultures pretending to mourn. Only Thomas stayed behind. He waited until the last car was gone before turning to Richard, who was standing by the iron gates with his umbrella. So, Thomas said quietly, his tone sharp under the rain, "When do we talk about the will?" Richard sighed, as if he'd been expecting the question. "Tomorrow morning, at the firm." "You should. Prepare yourself. Thomas, your father made changes. Changes!" His voice rose. Brittle. "He told me he forgave me." I sat with him? He said, "I know what he said." Richard cut in, lowering his voice. "But you know your father." Words were sentiment. Paper was law. For the first time, Thomas looked uncertain. What did he do? Richard's eyes softened, but he didn't answer. "Come tomorrow." "You'll see." That night, Thomas drove back to the house. He hadn't been there in years. The place smelled of dust and faint lavender, the trace of his mother's perfume still clinging to the curtains. Every photo, every piece of furniture seemed frozen in time. His reflection in the grand hallway mirror startled him. The grey, the fatigue, the faint tremor in his hands. I went straight to the study, the same room where I'd confronted him years before. The papers were gone, the desk polished, but the memory still clung like smoke. He poured himself me old scotch, the wine the respect of her chair. "You old bastard," he muttered into the empty room. "You couldn't just let it go, could you?" The clock ticked. The storm battered the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, the heating system groaned, like the place itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. He drank more than he should have that night. Somewhere, between his third and fourth glass, he began talking aloud, not to anyone living, but to me. "You think you won," he said bitterly. "You think cutting me out fixes anything. You made me this way. You built your empire on control, and you couldn't stand that I wanted something for myself." He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood. "You taught me to fight, to never settle. Then you punished me for doing it better than you. You called it greed, but it was ambition. I was your legacy, his." Voice cracked then, anger giving way to something closer to grief. "You were supposed to be proud of me, damn it. You were supposed to understand." Lightning flashed, illuminating the shelves lined with law books and ledgers. In that brief flare of light, he saw my portrait and oil painting Margaret had insisted on commissioning the year before she died. My gaze in that picture was hard, commanding, proud. He threw the glass at it. The sound shattered through the room, and the scotch splattered down like amber tears. The portrait tilted, the frame cracking slightly at the corner. Thomas stared at it for a long moment, breathing hard, then sank to his knees. His voice was barely a whisper. "You forgave me. Why did you still destroy me?" There was no answer on Liserin. By morning, the storm had passed. The world was grey and dripping, the air heavy with that clean smell that follows destruction. Thomas dressed in a black suit and drove to Richard's office, his expression set like a man walking toward a verdict. Richard was waiting in the conference room, papers neatly stacked in front of him. Two witnesses sat to the side, their eyes avoiding Thomas's. "Let's get this over with," Thomas said flatly, sitting across from the lawyer. Richard nodded and began to read. The words were clinical, legalistic, but each one landed like a hammer. "I left nothing to him, not the house, not the company shares, not the accounts. Every cent was donated to foundations, scholarships, and workers' relief funds. The Callahan fortune was no longer a private empire, it was a public legacy." When Richard finished, silence filled the room. Thomas sat motionless, his jaw working, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "So that's it. Es atlas dieses Wort, not even my mother's ring." Richard hesitated, then slid a small envelope across the table. "There's one thing. Your father left you a letter. Thomas froze. He stared at the envelope as though it might burn him. A lettre. Yes, he said I was to give it to you personally. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. Then he took the envelope with shaking hands, slipped it into his jacket, and stood. We're done here, he muttered. He didn't open the letter in the office. He didn't open it in the car. He drove for hours without direction until he found himself back at the old steel mill, where the machines sat silent and rusted under the grey sky. That was where he finally tore the envelope open. The letter was short. Only 2 paragraphs, written in my unmistakable handwriting, strong, deliberate, no tremor in the strokes, even at the end. Thomas, I forgave you because I love you. But love does not mean trust. You took what wasn't yours, and until you learn to build something of your own, you'll always live in the shadow of what I made. I hope this ending frees you not from me, but from the man you became when you forgot what it meant to earn. If you can rebuild your name without mine, then perhaps, one day, you'll finally understand why I did what I did. Father, Thomas read it twice, his hands tightening until the paper crumpled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel anger. He felt nothing. Just emptiness, vast and echoing, as if the letter had carved out whatever was left inside. He stood there until the wind picked up, carrying the smell of iron and rain. Then he dropped the letter, watched it tumble across the cracked concrete until it vanished into the mud. But later, much later, when night fell again and the factory lights flickered to life one by one, he came back for it. Because even in death, I still had the last word. Months slipped into a year, and the man who had once worn tailored suits and carried the scent of cologne and boardrooms now smelled of iron, sweat, and would smoke. And Tomac or the Ming else entirely. The people of Hollow Ridge didn't care who he'd been, only who he was now. They called him Sir Callaghan's. Well, did France repaired tools. He drank at the small bar by the gas station, where the jukebox played the same 6 songs every night. He lived in the quiet rhythm of work and rest, of purpose stripped bare of ego. But every morning, before the town woke, he would walk to the edge of the river that cut behind the shop and sit on the old wooden dock. He'd take his father's notebook, now half filled with his own words, and read a random page. Sometimes he'd add to it notes on a design, a line of thought about legacy, a confession he couldn't say aloud. He never signed his entries. It felt enough just to write. One morning, as dawn broke pale and misty, a stranger found him there. A young man, maybe 25, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the kind of nervous look that comes from desperation and pride colliding. Hey, the young man said. You the guy who runs Hollow Forge? Don't your ned's the light. That depends who's asking. Name's Eli. Harris said you might be looking for help. Thomas studied him for a moment. The kid had grease under his fingernails, same as him, but his eyes were sharp, hungry, the kind of hunger Thomas recognized instantly. Evert. Worked a forge before. Eli shrugged. Worked machines. Sure. Steel's just another kind of machine, isn't it? Thomas smiled, faintly, not exactly. But you'll learn. He handed Eli a pair of gloves and led him to the workshop, a squat brick building at the edge of town. Its walls lined with tools, blueprints, and the faint hum of heat and effort. The place smelled of sweat and ambition. First rule, Thomas said, lighting the furnace, respect the fire. It gives you shape, but it'll burn. If you don't pay attention. Eli smirked. Sounds like a metaphor. Maybe it is. They worked in silence for most of the morning. Eli was quick clumsy at first, but not afraid to fail. He asked questions that showed thought, not arrogance. Thomas found himself remembering another pair of young hands his own hammering. Beside his father, under the roar of molten steel. By noon, they'd shaped their first piece, a simple steel hinge, clean and strong. Eli grinned when he held it up. Didn't think I'd be proud of a hinge, he said. Thomas chuckled. You'd be surprised what pride looks like when you stop chasing the wrong kind. That night, after Eli left, Thomas stayed in the workshop long after dark. The furnace glowed low, and the sound of the wind outside carried through the cracks in the walls. He opened his father's notebook again and began to write. There's a boy working with me now. Reminds me of myself at his age, restless, too sure of himself, but honest in a way I never was. I caught him staring at the forge like it was something sacred. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe Dad would have liked him. He paused, pen hovering. I think I finally understand what he wanted from me. It wasn't obedience. It was purpose. A man who builds for others lives longer than one who builds for himself. He closed the notebook and rested his hands against it. The pages were filled, now his father's lessons and his own mingled together, a dialogue across time. A ledger of mistakes and understanding. Weeks later, Hollow Forge began to attract attention. Word spread about the quality of the work, about the man who didn't advertise but never failed to deliver. A local journalist came by, asking questions. You used to be someone else, didn't you? She asked carefully, looking around the shop. Callahan Steele, maybe? Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Used to be, he said. What happened? He thought for a long moment before answering. I stopped building for the world and started building for people. She smiled at that. That's a quote. Then write it down, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. But don't write my name. Just Tom. That's enough. The article came out a week later. The blacksmith who beline, passé da runbe. People who still believed in small second chances. Business grew, he hired, the shop expanded. And one afternoon, when the mail truck stopped by, the driver handed Thomas an envelope with an embossed seal. Callahan Steele. He froze. It had been over a year since he'd seen that name in print. He carried the envelope to his desk, sat down, and opened it. Inside was a letter, not from the company lawyers, but from the board. Mr. Callahan, it began. We understand your estrangement from the company's affairs. However, recent restructuring has left a vacancy in leadership. Given your history and the values you seem to now represent, we would like to offer you an advisory role. The company your father built is struggling. We could use your insight. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. His pulse didn't race, but something deep inside stirred something old, patient, waiting. He folded the letter carefully, walked outside, and stood in the sunlight. Eli was hammering a spark, fleeing his focus. The sight made Thomas smile. He went back inside, pulled out a blank page from the back of his notebook, and began to write again. They want me back. The Empire. The ghosts. The name. But I think I've already found what he wanted me to find. Maybe I'll visit. Not to reclaim it, but to remind them what Callahan Steele was meant to stand for. Maybe the company can still be saved not through power, but through humility. He signed it with one word, Thomas. Then he looked at the letter one, last time before dropping it into the forge. The flames curled around it, devouring the seal, turning the company's offer to ash. Eli looked up from the anvil. What was that? Just an old debt, Thomas said. Finally paid. That night, the sky above Hollow Ridge burned with the colors of sunset gold and red. And violet, like the world itself, was being reforged. And for the first time since his father's deathbed, Thomas didn't feel haunted. He felt forged anew, tempered by fire, by loss, by forgiveness, and by the simple act of building something honest from the ashes of what once was. But fate, like steel, bent slowly. And deep in the world he'd left. Behind, in the offices of Callahan Steele, a new storm was beginning to gather, one that would test just how much of his father's fire truly lived on inside him. 2 years later, the storm that had been gathering finally broke. It began with a name one Thomas hadn't heard in years, Evelyn Ward, the sharp-eyed financial officer who had once been his father's most trusted advisor. She had stayed with Callahan Steele after the old man's death, weathering the mergers and buyouts, the hollow promises of new leadership, and now she'd found him. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a courier. The envelope was thick, the handwriting elegant and familiar. Tom, I don't know if you've been following the news, but the company's dying. They're selling off the mills. One by one, your father's name is being turned into scrap. I stayed as long as I could, but they don't listen anymore. They've gutted everything he built. There's one last board meeting before they finalize the sale. If you have even an ounce of your father's pride left, come home, not for them, for him. Evelyn Thomas read it 3 times, his hands motionless. Cut sharper than he expected. They're selling off the mills. That was the line that caught him, twisting something deep in his chest. He set the letter down on the workbench, staring at the open forge in front of him. The fire hissed and breathed like a living thing, its heat pressing against his skin. Eli entered the room, wiping sweat from his brow. You look like someone just told you your truck died. Thomas didn't answer at first. He passed the letter over silently. Eli read it quickly, his eyebrows rising. Callahan Steele, he murmured. Didn't you touch? Their last letter. Yeah, Thomas said quietly. Maybe I should have burned this one too, so don't go, Eli said simply, leaning against the wall. You've got a life here. People who actually give a damn. Why walk back into a fire you already escaped? Thomas stared into the flames again. Because my father built those mills. And if they fall now, everything he stood for dies. With them, Eli crossed his arms. And if you go back, you'll end up just like him. Thomas didn't respond. The silence stretched. Finally, he said, maybe that's not such a bad thing. That night, after the shop closed, he pulled out his father's notebook again. The leather was worn now, the pages filled with both their handwriting. He turned to one of the earliest entries, the one his father had written during the company's rise. The measure of a man isn't how much he owns, but what he refuses to sell. He traced the words with his finger. The firelight flickered across the ink, and for the first time in years, he whispered aloud. You always did have a way of making a point, old man. By dawn, he'd made his decision. When Eli came in, Thomas was already packed. You're really going, the younger man said, disbelief in his voice. Tomano did the while I'm gone. Keep the fire lit. Don't let it die. Eli hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed him something small and dark, a piece of folded steel, shaped like a coin. Made it last night, he said. Incas, you forget what you've built here. Thomas smiled, faintly. I won't. He left Hollow Ridge that morning, the sun just breaking over the horizon. The road wound through fields and forests, each mile peeling back layers of the life he'd built. By the time the skyline of the city appeared grey and jagged against the sky, he felt the weight of memory pressing against his chest. Callahan Steele's headquarters looked smaller than he remembered. Once a symbol of power, it now felt like a mausoleum, windows dark, the great smokestack silent. The sign outside was half-rusted, one letter missing. Callahan Steele. Evelyn met him in the lobby. She was older now, hair streaked with silver, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. You came, she said softly. Didn't give me much choice. He replied. She smiled thinly. You sound like your father. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. A dozen executives sat around the table, their suits crisp, their faces tired. At the head of the table sat Harold Finch, the interim CEO, a man with a politician's smile and a banker's soul. Mr. Callahan, Finch said, standing to greet him. I wasn't expecting a ghost. Thomas ignored the hand. You're selling off the mills. Finch gestured to the projection screen behind him. We prefer to call it strategic divestment. The market's changed. Mr. Callahan, steel's not what it used to be. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over the charts, the graphs, the hollow words. My father built this company to last generations. Tearing it apart for quarterly profits. Finch's smile didn't falter. Your father built an empire. You ran from it. Don't come back now pretending to save what you abandoned. Evelyn's hand tightened on the table, but Thomas's expression stayed calm. You're right, he said quietly. I did run. Because I had to learn what he was really building. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small piece of steel Eli had given him. It caught the light, gleaming faintly. He set it on the table. This, he said, was made in a forge smaller than this room. No machines, no shareholders, no greed. Just work. Purpose. You've forgotten what that feels like. A murmur rippled through the room. Finch frowned. This isn't a philosophy lecture, Mr. Callahan. It's business. Exactly, Thomas said. And business without soul dies. You're selling Callahan steel for scraps when you could rebuild it. The mills aren't worthless, they're just leaderless. Finch laughed under his breath. And you think you're that leader? Thomas met his gaze. No, but I'm the only one who remembers what this place was supposed to mean. The room went silent. Evelyn watched him, something flickering behind her. Composed expression, hope, maybe, or the faint spark of belief. After the meeting, as the board argued and whispered, Evelyn followed him into the hallway. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I had to. They'll never let you take control." "Finch owns half the votes, then I'll take what's left and build around it," Thomas said. "Callahan, steel doesn't belong to them. It belongs to every man and woman who ever bled for it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your father would have been proud." Thomas smiled, faintly. He'd have yelled first. That night, he walked through the old mill district. The air smelled of rust and rain. Broken machines lay silent under flickering streetlights. He stopped beside the old furnace, the one he'd watched his father fire decades ago, and laid a hand against its cold surface. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for waiting so long." Then, almost reverently, he took a lighter from his pocket, flicked it open, and dropped the flame into the ashes. It caught instantly, a faint orange glow spreading through the blackened pit. The fire returned to Callahan Steel that night, small, fragile but alive. And as the flames rose higher, Thomas knew the story wasn't ending. The inheritance his father had taken from him wasn't gone. It had just been tempered, waiting for the day he was strong enough to wield it without destroying himself. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Finch had already made a deal behind closed doors. One that would turn the company's resurrection into something darker. And by the time Thomas discovered it, forgiveness would no longer be enough. 3 months later, the fire that Thomas rekindled burned brighter than ever, but so did the shadow growing behind it. The furnace at Mill 7 roared again for the first time in years. Workers old and young returned to their stations, their hands remembering the rhythm of hammer and steel as if it had been sleeping under their skin. Newspapers called it the resurrection of Callahan Steel. Cameras came. Investors sniffed opportunity. Thomas didn't care about the attention. What mattered was the sound, the heartbeat of molten iron pouring. The clang of life coming back to something everyone else had written off as dead. It was his father's ghost made flesh and fire again. But in the polished conference rooms downtown, far from the heat and sweat of the mills, another kind of fire was being stoked. Harold Finch sat behind his desk, staring at the signed contract spread before him. The ink was dry. The sale of 49% of Callahan Steel's assets to Aegis Global Holdings was complete. He smiled a small, reptilian twist of the lips. "Legacy doesn't pay dividends," he murmured. The deal was simple, brutal, and brilliant. On paper, it looked like an investment partnership. In truth, it was a quiet dismantling. Aegis would siphon the company's assets into offshore shells, strip it for patents and real estate, and leave behind a hollow shell wearing the Callahan name. When Evelyn found out, she stormed into Finch's office, eyes blazing. "You sold us out." Finch didn't even look up. "I saved us." "The world doesn't need factories, Evelyn. It needs capital. You think Daniel Callahan built this place to be traded like currency?" Finch's gaze was cold. "Daniel Callahan is dead. His ideals died with him. What matters now is profit." Evelyn leaned across the desk, her voice low and trembling with anger. "Then you don't understand what kind of man his son has become." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Finch said. "He's a symbol. Symbols are useful until they aren't." He turned back to his laptop. "Close the door on your way out." That evening, Evelyn drove to the mill herself. She found Thomas standing near the open furnace, his face lit by the glow of molten steel. The men were finishing the day's last pour, their movements deliberate and sure. It was almost beautiful, like watching devotion in motion. "We're in trouble," she said without preamble. "Thomas tournait de Wyme's brow." "What kind?" "The kind with signatures and fine print," she said. "Finch sold nearly half the company to Aegis Global." Thomas froze. The noise of the furnace faded in his ears until all he could hear was his heartbeat. "He what?" "He thinks it's just business," Evelyn said bitterly. "But it's theft. The same kind you my father took zi." Old rage stirred the kind he'd buried in Hollow Ridge. Under the soot and forgiveness, he took a slow breath, steadying himself. "How long do we have before the sale goes public?" 2 weeks, maybe less. Once it hits the market, there's no taking it back. Thomas's jaw clenched. "Then we stop it before that happens." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. You sound like him again. He met her eyes. Maybe it's time someone did. The next day's blurred into motion. Thomas barely slept. He met with old union leaders, investors his father had trusted, workers whose pensions Finch had gutted. One by one, they agreed to stand with him not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. At night, he sat in the old office overlooking the mill, writing in the notebook he still carried. "It took everything from me once. I forgave him. But I can't forgive this. Not again. I used to think my inheritance was gone. Now I see it was waiting for this fight." He closed the notebook and stared out the window at the burning furnaces. This time, he whispered to the ghost that lived in the smoke, "I won't fail you." When Finch's announcement finally came, it was staged like a coronation. Cameras, shareholders, polished speeches about partnership and growth. Thomas arrived uninvited. The doors of the auditorium parted as he stepped inside, his presence sending ripples of murmurs through the crowd. Finch's smile faltered mid-sentence. "Mr. Callahan," he said coolly, "this is a private." It was Thomas interrupted, walking to the stage. "Until you sold it." He turned to face the crowd. "My father built this company with the sweat of thousands of people who believed in something bigger than a quarterly report. And this man," he pointed at Finch, "wants to sell it to a corporation that doesn't even make steel." Reporters lifted their cameras. The room buzzed. Finch straightened, his voice measured. "This company was dying before I came along." "You can't stop progress, Mr. Callahan." "Progress?" Thomas said, his tone sharp as glass. "Progress doesn't mean burning your roots. It means reforging them." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've seen your contracts, offshore accounts, asset transfers, fraud, Harold. You didn't save this company, you gutted it." The audience erupted. Finch's face went pale. "You have no proof." "Oh, I have plenty," Thomas said. "And so does the state attorney." Gasps rippled through the room. Evelyn stepped forward from the crowd, holding up a thick folder. "Copies of everything," she said clearly. "Finch used Aegis to funnel money into subsidiaries he controls." Finch lunged toward her, but security intercepted him. The press surged forward. Cameras flashed. And in that chaos, Thomas stood perfectly still, watching the man who had almost destroyed his father's legacy be led away in handcuffs. Weeks later, the mills were quiet again, not dead, but resting. The company was under investigation, the board dissolved. Control was handed to an independent trust, the same workers whose sweat had built every ton of steel that bore the Callahan name. Evelyn came to see him one last time before the hearings ended. "You could have taken it back, you know," she said. "The company, the title, the legacy." Thomas smiled faintly. "I already did." He looked out over the yards, where new workers were repainting the faded sign. "Callahan's steel hole again." "Let them build it this time," he said quietly. "I've done enough breaking." Evelyn nodded. "Your father would have liked that, maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe he'd tell me I should have fought harder. But for once, I think he'd be proud." She smiled. "So what will you do now?" He turned the small steel coin, in his hand the one Eli had forged. It gleamed in the sunlight. "Go home," he said. "There's a forge waiting for me." When he returned to Hollow Ridge, the town was alive with the sound of hammers again. Eli stood at the anvil, grinning when he saw him. "Did you fi? Ecaledo," Thomas laughed. "No, I just melted it down." He walked into the forge, the heat wrapping around him like an old friend. For the first time he no-nos, no bitanes no one's only zephyr, steady and pure. He opened the notebook one final time, turned to a blank page, and wrote, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you rebuild when everything's been taken from you." He closed it, laid it on the workbench, and picked up the hammer. The sound that followed wasn't just the ring of steel. It was the echo of forgiveness finally, complete of a man who'd learned that the truest inheritance wasn't wealth, or vengeance, or even pride. It was knowing how to start again. Winter came early that year. Hollow Ridge, usually green and restless with wind, was dusted in snow by the first week of November. The forge's chimney sent up a thin column of smoke that curled into the pale morning sky. The only sign of heat in a sleeping world. Inside, Thomas worked in silence. The anvil's rhythm had become the pulse of his day, steady, alive, unhurried. Each strike melted thought into motion, and in that sound, he felt the world make sense again. Eli had gone to visit family for the holidays, leaving him alone with the forge and his thoughts. He didn't mind. Solitude had stopped feeling like punishment. It was clarity. On the workbench beside him lay his father's notebook. The leather-worn, smooth by time and hands that had once gripped it in fury and reverence alike. Its pages were full, now every space marked with lines of ink, oil stains, and ash. He had written the final entry weeks ago, but some mornings he opened it just to look. It reminded him where he'd been, and how far he'd finally come. Outside, a car engine broke the quiet. Tires crunched against frozen gravel. Thomas frowned. No one came this far out without reason. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the cold. A black sedan idled in front of the workshop. From it emerged a woman wrapped in a long grey coat. She looked out of place in the snow-composed, sharp, purposeful. "Mr. Callahan," she called, her voice steady despite the wind. "That's me," Thomas said cautiously. "Who's asking?" The woman reached into her coat and produced a leather folder. "My name's Rachel Monroe. I'm with the Department of Commerce." "Where've I been?" "Reviewing the Callahan Steele investigation." "You were a key witness, and I gave my statement," he interrupted gently. "Twice. Yes," she said, "but I'm not here about that." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "The federal trustees have decided to rebuild the company under public ownership. They want you on the board. An honorary position, at least." Thomas let out a slow breath, watching it cloud. "The air. You people never learn. Do you?" Rachel blinked. "Excuse me." He smiled faintly. "The moment you rebuild something, everyone starts trying to own it again." She tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe, but sometimes the right people make all the difference. The workers trust you. The press respects you. Callahan Steele is still a symbol, and like it or not, you're the story." He turned his gaze toward the forge, its glow flickering through the open door. "Symbols have a bad habit of burning people," he said. Rachel hesitated, then said quietly, "So did your father." "But you came back anyway." That made him pause. The truth of it hung between them, soft and undeniable. "I'm not my father," he said. "Finally." "No," she agreed. "But maybe that's why you can save what he built." He didn't answer right away. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of snow and coal dust. Somewhere behind him, the forge popped and hissed, the fire calling him back to work. Rachel waited a few moments longer, then sighed. "Think about it," she said, tucking the folder back into her coat. "If you change your mind, call me." When she left the rent again, Thomas stood there long after the sound of her car faded. He thought about his father, the steel-hard certainty, the love disguised as command. He thought about his own mistakes, the son who had once believed power was the only way to be remembered. He looked down at his hands. The calluses were deep now, the scars faint, but constant reminders. They were his hands of a builder, not a ruler. He went back inside, fed the forge another log, and sat down at the workbench. The warmth spread through him slowly, chasing away the cold. For a long time, he stared at the notebook. Then, with careful hands, he opened to the first page, the one his father had written decades ago. "The measure of a man isn't how much he owns, but what he refuses to sell." He smiled softly. "You were right, old man," he murmured. "But you left out something." He reached for a pen and added beneath it, "and what he chooses to build when no one's watching." Then he closed the notebook, stood, and lifted the steel bar from the anvil. It was glowing red, pliant. He raised the hammer and brought it down, each strike ringing through the quiet forge like a heartbeat reborn. Uphold. The snow outside deepened. When he finally stopped, what lay before him wasn't another hinge, or blade, or tool. It was something simpler and infinitely more personal, a small steel plaque, hand-forged and engraved with steady precision. He held it to himself. Daniel Sael el HNBULT fier oui. Reborn in forgiveness. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes only when a long war has finally ended. The next morning, before dawn, he drove back to the hill, overlooking the mill, the place where his parents rested. The snow was deep, the world utterly still. He brushed off the headstone, knelt, and set the plaque against the marble. "Did what you asked," softly. "But I did it my way." The wind stirred, faint and cold, carrying the faint hum of the distant mills. He liked to think it was his father's voice, rough, approving, proud. Thomas stood, looking out over the horizon, where the first light of morning touched the world. He could see the faint smoke of the furnaces rising, the city, still sleeping beneath it. He turned back toward his truck, hands in his coat pockets, and for the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing down on him. Not legacy, not guilt, not even forgiveness, just peace. And as the wind carried the scent of steel and snow across the hill, he smiled once more and whispered, "Goodbye, Dad." Then he walked away not as the heir of Callahan Steel, not as the son seeking redemption, but simply as a man who had learned what every forge teaches. That even the hardest metal can be reshaped if you're willing to face the fire long enough to change. Spring came late that year, as if the earth itself had been reluctant to thaw after too many years of cold. But when it did, it came quietly, ice dripping from eaves, rivers loosening, soil softening under the patient sun. And in that tender in-between, Thomas Callahan began again. The forge in hollow, ridge hummed with life. New faces worked beside the old men and women who'd left broken industries. Young apprentices eager to learn a craft that demanded both patience and humility. Hollow Forge had grown from a modest workshop into a living rhythm of its own. Eli returned from the city with a grin and a dozen new ideas. "You won't believe this," he said, tossing a folded newspaper onto the workbench. Across the front page, the headline read, "Callahan Steel reopens under worker ownership, a new era of American industry." Beneath the headline was a photograph, the mill alive again, smoke curling from the stacks like breath, returning to the dead. And in the corner of the image, a bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the sun. Thomas recognized it instantly. His plaque! He smiled slow, quiet, disbelieving. "They kept it." Eli leaned against the anvil, grinning. "Of course they did. You made it with your own hands." Disbarred. Of the story now, Thomas looked down at the page, fingers tracing the outline of the letters. "You ever think," Eli said, "that maybe you and your old man weren't all that different?" Thomas chuckled. "We were the same metal," he said. "We just needed different fires." That evening, as the last light faded over Hollow Ridge, he sat outside on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The forge was quiet now, but its warmth still radiated through the air, a living pulse. The valley stretched before him, green and full again. Somewhere in the distance, the low whistle of a freight through the hills of Samsung. He'd grown up hearing outside the mill as a boy. It was strange how the world turned back on itself, circling. The same sounds, the same lessons, until you finally learned to listen. He thought about Rachel Monroe, the woman from the Department of Commerce. She had written him twice since winter, both letters polite but insistent. The latest one had ended with, "Greater than the country needs builders again, not traders. Men like your father lit the furnaces that built this nation. Maybe it's time you helped light the next ones." He hadn't answered yet. He didn't know if he ever would. The forge here was enough. But sometimes, just sometimes, when he looked out at the dark horizon, he felt something stir. Not ambition, not pride, just possibility. Later that week, a familiar sound cut through the clang and hum of the forger car engine, tires crunching gravel. He wiped his hands and stepped outside. It was Rachel again. She climbed out of her car, smiling in the soft afternoon light. "You didn't write back. I'm better with hammers than pens," he said, still avoiding offices. "Always." She laughed quietly. "I was nearby for a conference. Thought I'd stop by and see what a legend looks like in person." He shook his head. "I'm no legend. Just a man who ran out of things to lose." They stood for a moment. In comfortable silence. The smell of iron drifted through the air, the steady beat of metal from inside marking time. "You've built something good here," she said. "Real. It's rare." He nodded. "I think that's the point." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever miss it? The scale? The noise of it, all the empire your father built?" Tom's look badge, where Eliand. The others worked, faces glowing in the firelight, laughter rising over the clang. Sometimes, he admitted, but only the parts that felt alive. Rachel nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all. Any of this is keeping the parts that matter alive." He smiled faintly. and learning to let the rest burn. She looked at him for a long moment, something soft and curious in her expression. "You know," she said, "if you ever decide to teach what you've learned, people would listen. Maybe," he said. "But I think the fire teaches better than I ever could." She laughed quietly, then reached into her coat and handed him a small envelope. "In case you change your mind," she said. "It's not about politics this time, it's about mentorship. Programs for rebuilding trades across the country." Réal work, c'est réal. "People." He took it, tucking it into his pocket without looking. "I'll think about it," she smiled, sensing he meant it. "Good." When she left, the quiet returned. He stood there for a while, the envelope heavy, in his hand, before finally going back inside. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, he sat at the workbench under the dim lamp. The forge still glowed. Low behind him, a single breath of orange heat. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single line, handwritten, "Greater than America doesn't need more owners. It needs more builders." No name, no title, just that. He smiled. Then he reached for the old notebook again, turning to the very last page, the only one left blank. "Dad," he wrote, "you were right about fire. It burns, it hurts, it tests. But you never told me that sometimes it heals too." He paused, then added, "I've met people worth building for. And maybe, just maybe, the steel you forged in me was meant for them, not for your empire. You gave me the heat. I finally found the shape." He closed the notebook, set it aside, and returned to the anvil. This time, he wasn't working on hinges or tools. He was shaping something new, a simple steel sculpture of two intertwined flames. One larger, one smaller, bound together yet distinct. When it was finished, he placed it on the shelf above the workbench, beside the old photograph of his parents. The next morning, as dawn crept through the workshop windows, Eli found him already at work. Couldn't sleep again. Eli asked. Thomas smiled, without looking up. "Didn't want to." "There's too much to make." The forge roared back to life, brighter and stronger than ever. Outside, Hollow Ridge began to wake, the hum of trucks, the smell of rain in the air, the sound of life returning. And for the first time, Thomas Callahan felt the weight of legacy, not as a burden, but as a warmth. A living thing, carried forward, not by power or inheritance, but by hands that knew what it meant to build from the ashes. He struck the anvil once more, the sound rolling through the valley like thunder turned to promise. Somewhere in that echo, the world turned a little quieter, a little steadier. And if you listened closely beneath the hum of steel, beneath the whisper of wind, you could almost hear a voice, low and proud, saying, "That's my boy." Years later, when time had softened the scars of industry and the weight of his name had finally become something gentle, not heavy, Thomas Callahan stood again on the hill where his father was buried. The sky above was grey, streaked with gold. And below him the world hummed alive with the sound of steel and rain and the faint murmur of wind through the trees. He came alone this time. He didn't bring flowers. Just the same plaque he had forged years before, polished anew, its surface shining in the muted light. He knelt, setting it beside the older one, the way a craftsman lays down the last piece of a finished work. Daniel Sele la Chambeyelte. In fire, reborn in forgiveness, Thomas Callahan, built from ashes, reborn in peace. He smiled faintly, tracing the carved letters with his fingertips. "It's done, Dad," he said quietly. "For both of us." He closed his eyes, letting the wind carry the weight of those words into the distance. Below, the faint hum of the mill rolled through the valley, a sound that had once meant power, now reborn as purpose. Callahan Steel had become something different, something cleaner. Worker-owned, community-built, no longer bound by the greed that had once nearly destroyed it. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Hollow Forge, too, had grown. Where once there had been a single workshop, now stood three, each humming with the sound of creation. Apprentices came from far and wide to learn not just how to shape metal, but how to build with meaning. And they all spoke of the man who taught them that fire didn't just destroy it, refined. He had stopped calling himself Callahan years ago. To the people in Hollow Ridge, he was just Tom, the blacksmith with kind eyes and a quiet laugh, the man who worked beside them instead of above them. That anonymity had become his peace. He looked out over the valley one last time. The mill, smoke curled upward in soft ribbons, blending into the pale clouds. The faint clang of steel carried on the wind, the same music he'd grown up with. But different now. Calmer, human, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last remnant of his father's notebook. He had torn out a single page before burning the rest, the first page, the one that had begun it all. The measurations automas my led. You were right, old man. You always were. He folded the page once, tucked it under the plaque, and stood. The ache in his knees reminded him of his years, but there was no bitterness in it. Only the ache of a life well used. As he turned to leave, he looked back one final time at the two names resting side by side, father and son. Two lives burned in different fires, both tempered by forgiveness. The wind rose, carrying with it the scent and something almost sacred. Goodbye, he whispered. And thank you. Then he walked down the hill slowly, steadily toward the life he had forged with his own hands. As a bottom did for him, Eli was there, a mainon with the forge. Behind him, the young apprentices were laughing, their voices blending with the rhythm of hammers and flame. Tomas my lad hold beginnings. He stepped inside the workshop, the air warm, the light alive. The fire breathing softly in the heart of the forge. He reached for his hammer, felt the weight of it settle into his hand, and took his place beside the others. The first strike rang out clear and sure, echoing through the valley, through the mills. Through the memory of every Callahan who had ever bled for steel. It was not the sound of legacy. It was the sound of peace. And in that sound pure, final, unbroken, the story of the Callahans ended exactly as it was meant to. Not in inheritance, not in revenge, but in creation. The fire burned steady. The forge lived on. And the name Callahan, at last, belonged to something whole. Of wind you could almost hear a voice, low and proud, saying, "That's my boy." Years later, when time had softened the scars of industry and the weight of his name had finally become something gentle, not heavy, Thomas Callahan stood again on the hill where his father was buried. The sky above was grey, streaked with gold, and below him the world hummed alive with the sound of steel and rain and the faint murmur of wind through the trees. He came alone this time. He didn't bring flowers. Just the same plaque he had forged years before, polished and new, its surface shining in the muted light. He knelt, setting it beside the older one, a way a craftsman lays down the last piece of a finished work. Daniel Sel la chaîne bueltine fier revenus, Thomas Sel la chaîne built from ashes. Reborn in peace. He smiled faintly, tracing the carved letters with his fingertips. "It's done, Dad," he said quietly. "For both of us." He closed his eyes, letting the wind carry the weight of those words into the distance. Below, the faint hum of the mill rolled through the valley, sound that had once meant power, now reborn as purpose. Callahan steel had become something different, something cleaner. Worker-owned, community-built, no longer bound by the greed that had once nearly destroyed it. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Hollow Forge, too, had grown. Where once there had been a single workshop, now stood three, each humming with the sound of creation. Apprentices came from far and wide to learn not just how to shape metal, but how to build with meaning. And they all spoke of the man who taught them that fire didn't just destroy it, refined. He had stopped calling himself Callahan years ago. To the people in Hollow Ridge, he was just Tom, the blacksmith with kind eyes and a quiet laugh, the man who worked beside them instead of above them. That anonymity had become his peace. He looked out over the valley one, last time. The mill, smoke curled upward in soft ribbons, blending into the pale clouds. The faint clang of steel carried on the wind the same music he'd grown up with, but different now, calmer, human. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last remnant of his father's notebook. He had torn out a single page before burning the rest, the first page, the one that had begun it all. Mesamer how much he owns. Tomas my led, you were right on. You always were. He folded the page once, tucked it under the plaque, and stood. The ache in his knees reminded him of his years, but there was no bitterness in it, only the ache of a life well used. As he turned to leave, he looked back one final time at the two names resting side by side, father and son. Two lives burned in different fires, both tempered by forgiveness. A wind rose, carrying with it something almost sacred. "Goodbye," he whispered. "And thank you." Then he walked down the hill slowly, steadily toward the life he had forged with his own hands. As a bottomage for him, of the forge. Behind him, the young apprentices were laughing, their voices blending with the rhythm of hammers and flame. Thomas Smiled, the kind of smile that holds both endings and beginnings. He stepped inside the workshop, the air warm, the light alive, the fire breathing softly in the heart of the forge. He reached for his hammer, felt the weight of it settle into his hand, and took his place beside the others. The first strike rang out clear and sure, echoing through the valley, through the mills, through the memory of every Callahan who had ever bled for steel. It was not the sound of legacy. It was the sound of peace. And in that sound pure, final, unbroken, the story of the Callahans ended exactly as it was meant to, not in inheritance, not in revenge, but in creation. The fire burned steady, the forge lived on, and the name Callahan, at last, belonged to something whole. Of Wind you could almost hear a voice, low and proud, saying, "That's my boy." Years later, when time had softened the scars of industry, and the weight of his name had finally become something gentle, not heavy, Thomas Callahan stood again on the hill where his father was buried. The sky above was grey, streaked with gold, and below him the world hummed alive with the sound of steel and rain and the faint murmur of wind through the trees. He came alone this time. He didn't bring flowers. Just the same plaque he had forged years before, polished anew, its surface shining in the muted light. He knelt, setting it beside the older one, a way a craftsman lays down the last piece of a finished work. Daniel sea ele lascia en beuel teine fiero reborns to masai lascia and built from ashes. He smiled with his fingertips. "It's done, Dad," he said quietly. "For both of us." He closed his eyes, letting the wind carry the weight of those words into the distance. Below, the faint hum of the mill rolled through the valley, a sound that had once meant power, now reborn as purpose. Callahan steel had become something different, something cleaner. Worker-owned, community-built, no longer bound by the greed that had once nearly destroyed it. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Hollow Forge, too, had grown. Where once there had been a single workshop, now stood three, each humming with the sound. Oh, F. Apprentices came from far and wide to learn not just how to shape metal, but how to build with meaning. And they all spoke of the man who taught them that fire didn't just destroy it, refined. He had stopped calling himself Callahan years ago. To the people in Hollow Ridge, he was just Tom, the blacksmith with kind eyes and a quiet laugh, the man who worked beside them instead of above them. That anonymity had become his peace. He looked out over the valley one last time. The mill, smoke curled upward in soft ribbons, blending into the pale clouds. The faint clang of steel carried on the wind, the same music he'd grown up with. But different now, human. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last remnant of his father's notebook. He had torn out a single page before burning the rest of the first page, the one that had begun it all. The mevision how much he owns. Tomas, my lad, you were right, old man. You always were. He folded the page once, tucked it under the plaque, and stood. The ache in his mind buterroir. No bitterness in it, only the ache of a life well used. As he turned to leave, he looked back one final time at the two names resting side by side, father and son. Two lives burned in different fires, both tempered by forgiveness. A winged rose carrying with the scent of roca and something almost sacred. Goodby, he whispered. And thank you. Then he walked down the hill slowly, steadily toward the life he had forged with his own hands. As a bottom, Hollow Ridge for him. Eli was there, a main way of the forge. Behind him, the young apprentices were laughing, their voices blending with the rhythm of hammers and flame. Thomas, my lad, hold beginnings. He stepped inside the workshop, the air warm, the light alive, the fire breathing softly in the heart of the forge. He reached for his hammer, felt the weight of it settle into his hand, and took his place beside the others. The first strike rang out clear and sure, echoing through the valley, through the mills, through the memory of every Callahan who had ever bled for steel. It was not the sound of legacy. It was the sound of peace. And in that sound pure, final, unbroken, the story of the Callahans ended exactly as it was meant to, not in inheritance, not in revenge, but in creation. The fire burned steady, the forge lived on. And the name Callahan, at last, belonged to something whole. You left $15 million to a stranger. My daughter's voice cracked as the lawyer slid the thick envelope across the mahogany table. Her hands trembled as she read the will aloud, her eyes darting toward the cold, smiling photograph of me framed in the corner of the office. And all we get is a fruitcake. The lawyer cleared his throat, his expression professional, but uneasy. To clarify, Mrs. Daniels, Your father stipulated that the stranger, monsieur, Wenrive must send you one fruit every Christmas for the rest of your lives. Only then will he retain the inheritance. The room erupted. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the scent of polished wood filled with the bitter tang of disbelief and betrayal. My son, Daniel, slammed his fist onto the table. That's insane. Who the hell is Owen Reeve? But that creature was Point Juignan. He was the man who saved my life when no one else cared enough to notice I was drowning. It started 30 years ago, long before the money, before the bitterness, before I became a man my children barely recognized. Back then, I was simply Harold Daniels, a mechanic who dreamed of owning a small shop and coming home to his wife and to laughing children. The Daniels family wasn't rich, but we were happy, or so I thought. My wife, Ellen, had a smile that could brighten up the entire block. We lived in a quiet corner of Vermont, where winters blanketed everything in peace, and summers smelled like pine and honey. But money has a way of whispering into people's ears. Sauf dat fierste, ten venomu. It started with small things, Ellen, wanting a better car, a bigger house, private school for the kids. I told her we couldn't afford it, that we were doing fine. She smiled and said she understood. That smile died the day she met Greg Saunders, a local real estate man who promised her more than I ever could. We die, she was gone took savings. And half of my soul. I drank. God, did I drink? The garage fell apart, the house got colder, and the silence became unbearable. I tried to call Daniel and Mary, but Ellen wouldn't let me near them, said I was unstable. Maybe I was. Maybe I wanted to be. One night, after too much bourbon, and to many regrets, I drove my truck onto a frozen lake. I thought the ice would hold. It didn't. I remember the water closing over, my head dark, cold, and silent. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, finally letting go. But then, through the blur and panic, I saw a light, a flashlight beam cutting through the night. A voice shouting my name, though he couldn't have known it. Then Armstrong, desperate, pulling me out, dragging me to shore. That was Owen. He was a stranger, just passing through town that winter. A carpenter looking for work. I found out later he'd been living out of his van, building birdhouses too.